Good evening, peasants, and welcome back inside the palace castle for yet another episode of Historia Mystoria. I am Professor Sponseller, and I am so glad that you're able to join me once again for some learning. Now, we're going to continue today with our study of Jamestown. We're going to look at Jamestown once it was established, and we're going to take a look especially at the slave labor that was kind of started and brought over to the first settlement of Jamestown. And so while you're learning, I'm going to go back here and hit me a few balls into the pockets. Enjoy the show, and we'll see you after the lesson. Hey guys, put that phone down for a second. We got some learning to do here about Jamestown. Yes, we're going to continue our look at Jamestown just like you did in our last episode of Historia Mystoria. And tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the development of slave labor in Jamestown. Because, see, Jamestown was successful, and we talked about how it was successful. But then to make it go even further and to make the profit that England wanted to have out of Jamestown, you were going to eventually have to have slave labor. Now, it wasn't always that easy. The actual people who were going to become slaves really started out as indentured servants. And if we'll take a look at that if we move forward in our lesson today. So to begin with, number one, all right, I want to talk a little bit about a headright. All right, the Virginia Company, when they gave the charter to enact and to set up Jamestown, were offering people who wanted to come to the New World, but it was very difficult to get people to want to come. It wasn't, something that was glamorous. It was an at-risk type idea for people to come here. They could be risking their lives. They've heard about the death of Roanoke Island, obviously, and it was the king's idea to try and keep that as mute as possible in England. The last thing he wanted to do was scare people away to not be able to settle in the New World, which would then kind of extinguish the flame of them becoming the newest empire in the world. Now, so exactly what is a headright? Because, well, that's all well and good. It sounds like something that's really disgusting. When you hear about head cheese off of a pig, for example, that's not quite what's going on here. But a headright is 50 acres of land given to each person who would pay their own way to Virginia. Now, Virginia wasn't paying people to get there. But if you were able to go and help set up the settlement of Jamestown, or anywhere else for that matter in Virginia, then you would be given 50 acres of land to do with what you wanted. Now, in this case, they wanted you to obviously, once we got tobacco and to farm and to make a profit. But overall, England just wanted people to settle there so that they could populate and become, obviously, another part of the British Empire as it would eventually become. So a headright, excuse me, an acre, of course you've heard of that before, but I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what that looks like on the screen here. It's 4,840 square yards. So if you're a sports person, think of a baseball field. Okay, start at home plate, and let's just say a normal, average high school field. Go all the way out into the outfield about halfway, both left, center, and right, and make that into a square, and you get about what an acre of land is. If you're more of a soccer or a football player, if you're on the pitch, if you're on the gridiron here, you can see that it's just a little bit past the midpoint, all right, or the midline, the half court line, half field line, whatever you want to call it, 50-yard line if you're a football player. That would be an acre, and not completely all the way across the field as in a soccer pitch, okay? So that gives you an idea of how much land. Now, multiply that by 50, and that's the land you get. A lot of farming ability, a lot of place to roam and have kids and cattle and different things that you want to do. It was really beneficial for those who could pay their own way to the New World. Now, that's all well and good. Cheerio, mates. How about working for the Virginia Company in the beautiful settlement of Jamestown? But see, the problem was trying to get people there after they realized that, hey, after all, only 66% of the people have died. So you have a 1 in 3 chance of surviving. You can imagine yourself trying to be like a travel agent back in this time, trying to convince people to go to the New World. How hard would that be with a 66% death rate? Probably not something that you would want to do for most people. Also, everyone that can pay for their own journey is to receive 50 free acres of land. And so what they've done is that they tell the truth, but then they are kind of giving you an incentive to try and go. Would you go? Depending on what your life was like. And that's exactly what was going on with a lot of these English citizens if they wanted to travel to the New World. So you get some people who say, well, that's tempting, but I'm an elitist. I have a great life here in England, so why would I want to give up that life? I don't need to go over there when I've got everything I need right here. That's just too much of a risk. And then you've got those who say, well, if I have to go over, then I have to work, but I've got servants here who do everything for me. I'm not going to worry about doing that. And then you get those who may not have a whole lot of money. Think about it. If you don't have a whole lot of money and your life isn't doing exactly what you want it to be here in England, wouldn't you give a chance to go over there and start life anew? And that's exactly what some of these people are going to do. Sounds great. Sign me up. After I receive my headright, I'm finally going to have land of my own. But I have one problem. I'm broke and can't pay for the journey. So you see the problem? Those who could pay wouldn't go. Those who couldn't pay couldn't go, and so England was put into a bind. And so what does England decide to do? Well, they begin, all right, the idea of indentured servantry. And Nova Britannia, which was a shipping company, is going to offer people to rides to go over as long as they work for England and become indentured servants for the church and for the king. And so the Virginia Company began to hire these indentured servants. And if you've seen the episode on the Pilgrims or the Separatists already, then you will have known what an indentured servant is. But if you haven't, just real quick, an indentured servant is an individual who works without wages for a specified number of years. It's usually between 4 and 7. Most of the time it's the later, in exchange for transportation to the colonies. That's what it was for here. It could also be used for land. It could also be used for other things. But in this case, if they agreed to work for, all right, England as an indentured servant, then they would get transportation to the colonies. Then, once they worked for 7 years, they would receive their 50 acres of land, and then they could do with that 50 acres of land what they chose to do. And so it seemed like a pretty decent deal if you wanted to really work for 7 years without getting paid, but what are you really working for? Well, see, this was the king's bright idea. All the kings in England are kings for a reason. They are intelligent people, well, for the most part. Not all of them, especially when we get to King John, but we'll get back to that at a later time. But here is an indentured servant's contract, and you sign it, and it's got the king's seal on it, as you can see, and that means that you are bound by that contract. Now, the biggest question I always get is like, well, how can they enforce this? You're going some 3,000 miles across the sea, and we're over here, and there's no really order and law over there. So how? Well, that's the point. It was kind of one of those on your word type deals to make sure that you are doing what you're going to do. Well, now, for example, indentured servantry didn't last too long in Jamestown. As a matter of fact, it wasn't too much later than that the first slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619, some 15 years after the settlement, or excuse me, some 12 years after the settlement was completely constructed. Now, they were brought here as indentured servants, okay? But eventually, most people said, again, because there wasn't any law and order, they said, well, if these people really would just work for nothing, then that's just going to make us even better. And so the king really started to agree and like the idea of slavery. And so soon afterwards, those Africans became the first slaves here in the New World. And the last thing I want to talk about today is what actually happens with the government. Okay, Jamestown was successful, but eventually they're going to have to sit down and create some laws. And so eventually the male settlers began to choose burgesses, or what we would know today as representatives, people who would represent the colony, all right, and kind of go back and forth between the king. They would meet in an assembly called the House of Burgesses. Now, why do I bring this up? It's important for American history because when you think about it, it becomes the first representative government in the New World. There hadn't been one before. And we have a representative government in our nation today. And so this kind of goes back to set that point up, all right, where the House of Burgesses, along with the governor who kind of ran the little areas of Jamestown, all right, made the laws. They sat down, they created the laws, and it became the first representative government in the English colonies, which was going to be kind of the blueprint for a lot of these other colonies as we continue moving forward into our next mission when we look at the northern, the middle, and the southern colonies. Okay, Not going to spend a lot of time here. Here's the definition of representative government. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to our government once the nation's been created. But it's a government in which voters elect representatives to make laws for them. Okay, it's kind of self-explanatory. It's the exact same thing that we get today. All right. Well, that'll just about wrap up our show here this evening, and I appreciate your attentiveness. You can go back to your phones in just a second. But understand that Jamestown as a collective whole was successful for these reasons. Eventually, they're going to set up their own kind of government. They're going to benefit from at first indentured servants and then eventually slaves. And Jamestown becomes the model for the first civilizations that come here after them as we set up and gain more population and eventually bigger and better colonies here in the New World. Well, once again, I thank you for watching this episode of Historia Mystoria. My evening's almost up, and yours is probably too. Can't wait to see you in class tomorrow, or it might be a Monday. Don't know whenever you're watching this video. But again, if you ain't learning, you ain't earning. And from everyone here at the castle, good night.